This is a strategy session titled Money Alone Can't Buy You Student Achievement. We have our moderator here, Lisa Snell. She's the Director of Education and Child Welfare with the Reason Foundation. We also have Andrew Coulson over here. He's the Director for the Center of Educational Reform at the Cato Institute. We also have Eric Hanushek. He's a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And we also have Mike Petrelli, who's the Vice President for National Programs and Policy at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. So I'm going to welcome now our moderator for the day, Lisa Snell.
Well, thank you very much for having us to Disney World and to Florida. My kids who are home in California are very sad that they're not here this week. In 1976, I was in the 4th grade in Orange County, California. And I remember it well because it was the bicentennial, and I remember my school picture had a little flag next to it. And there was a ritual in my family that we did the weekend before the first day of school. You would drive down to the school, and on the fence or the office window, the teacher assignments would be posted. And you would find out who your new teacher was. Well, it's 2008, I was going to say 7, and my kids go to a public school in California. And the school actually was built pretty innovatively. The developer in the development got to keep the impact fees, and they donated land to the school district, and they built a new school in 9 months for the development. The school has 1,200 kindergartner through 6th graders in this facility. They built a wired facility, and computers, technology, anything that you would want to be up to date as far as the school goes. Well, my kids go to year-round school, so school starts July 7th for them. The weekend of 4th of July, we will be driving to the school to look at their teachers posted on the fence. Because even though 30-some-odd years later, they have the resources and the capability to give parents and students information in a different way, they still post the teacher assignments on the fence at our public school. They don't use email or post it on a website or send a letter or do anything else. But they have the resources. They've been given the money, but it doesn't mean that they will use those resources effectively. And I think that's kind of the theme of this panel, is that resources and money doesn't guarantee you anything. It doesn't guarantee that the money will be spent effectively. Real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about one of the hottest crazes, I think, in education as far as what will solve the student achievement problems that we had, and you may have heard a little bit about it. Right now, everyone believes that if we invest heavily in early education, in universal preschool, as Obama would say, 0 to 5, that we will reap rewards as far as student achievement. Well, Oklahoma is a state that since 1998 has had universal preschool. And in Oklahoma, it's kind of the perfect storm for universal preschool advocates because it's funded as a grade by per pupil funding, 4-year-olds. It's in the public school system. 70% of the children are enrolled. The teachers are certified. They have a high quality curriculum. In fact, in Oklahoma, they score a 10 on the quality indicators that the National Institute for Early Education puts out. And they've been doing this since 1998. But an interesting thing about their statewide investment in universal preschool is that in Oklahoma, on the National Assessment of Education Progress, which you may have heard as a world-class standardized test that is benchmarked with other international tests, it's the nation's benchmark. It's, by all accounts, a fairly good way to measure how students are doing. So what has happened then to 4th graders in Oklahoma that have all gone through a universal preschool program? Well, in 1998, they scored 220, their average scale score on the NAEP for all 4th graders in the state of Oklahoma. In 2007, their average scale score was 217. In 1998, 19% of fourth graders were proficient in the state of Oklahoma. In 2007, 19% of fourth graders were proficient in the state of Oklahoma. As far as disadvantaged kids go, in 1998, and this is really who universal preschool is supposed to be directed at, is disadvantaged kids. In 1998, 42% of disadvantaged kids scored basic or above. In 2007, only 36% scored proficient, basic or above. So the scale score for Hispanic children in 1998 was 207. The scale score for Hispanic children in 2007 was 198. So for disadvantaged kids, for minority kids, for fourth graders in general, in the state of Oklahoma, after a decade-long investment in universal preschool, they actually have lower scores on the National Assessment of Education. So this is one way that we talk about we've had this large-scale investment in the whole nation in early education. In 1965, only 15% of kids were in preschool. In 2007, 80% of 4-year-olds go to some kind of early education. It's not necessarily state-run, and yet this huge investment as a nation that we've made in early education has not really changed any benchmark you want to use, whether it's the NAEP or the SAT. We are pretty much flat. So we've already made a huge investment as a nation in early education. And I just wanted to bring that up because it's just one current example of how, when they talk about the benefits, economic benefits of universal preschool, there's Nobel Prize winners that supposedly back it. And, they will look at, do 5-year-olds recognize more letters? But then 5 years later, no one's willing to come back and say, has it made a difference in fourth grade scores? Has it made a difference 10 years later in graduation rates? New Jersey, they had an adequacy lawsuit where the 31 Abbott districts had to offer universal preschool, as well as all kinds of other resources where they are funding kids to the tune of about $20,000. Right now they're fighting in New Jersey to get opportunity scholarship for kids in failing schools in those Abbott districts because their scores are so low. In Camden High, for example, 90% of Latino and African American children failed the math portion of the high school proficiency exam this year in 2007. At Camden, there was 600 students in the freshman class in 2003. In 2007, 172 of those students actually graduated. So they lost over 400 students at Camden High. Similarly, if you look at those 30 Abbott districts, I did an analysis from greatschools.net where I looked at the trend line for 3 years for fourth graders where they've had universal preschool in all those districts. And 75% of those school districts, of the 30 districts, the trends in math and reading were going in the wrong way, that they were scoring lower than they were in 2003 for fourth grade reading and math. So you have to look at achievement data, you have to tie it to money before you make these large-scale investments. In contrast, in Florida, where we have both accountability through the FCAT and the standards-based approach, and a variety of, school choice programs, on the NAEP, they had 47% of children below basic in 1998. And in 2007, they have 70% now of children that are basic or proficient or above. So they've seen a doubling of their NAEP scores in terms of proficiency in the same period of time that the other states invested in universal preschool. So incentives matter. Using both accountability and school choice incentives, Florida has increased their NAEP scores, whereas Oklahoma invested in one track of universal preschool and early education. They've seen no increase in their student achievement. So it's important to ask this question, and I know that the panelists here are going to go into all of this in more detail. Can money alone buy student achievement? No, we don't think so. So let's hear about this. Thank you.
if I can make technology work. Let me see. Present. That's not it.
They're all on the bottom taskbar.
They're on the bottom. Thank you. As I sat through the beginning of lunch, I think that part of my talk is just a long footnote to what was discussed at lunch. But what I want to do is go over first a little bit of evidence that talks about, does it matter that we do well on these tests that we commonly have? Now, everybody assumes that and just throws that out as it's obvious if you are in fact in favor of accountability. If you're against accountability, you say, well, these tests really don't mean much. There's other things that count, and businesses don't care about these tests and so forth. So I wanted to start briefly by providing an overview of whether or not these performance on these tests matters in some sense, and then talk a little bit about the questions of whether we can just do this with a resource-only strategy. I took to heart the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I wanted to play off that to demonstrate that I am up to the 4th grade Sunshine State math standards. I'm going to give you 10 pictures, which I figure is worth 10,000 words. Which is not a bad output for an afternoon if you could actually write 10,000 words. And I will provide a little bit of talk along the back of this for those of you who aren't visual learners. But the pictures I have, I think, summarize what I want to say pretty well. The first is the story that there's been a lot of discussion of the 20th century being the American century. And there's a recent book by Larry Katz and Claudia Golden at Harvard University that talks about the 20th century being the American century and simultaneously being the human capital century. They link those directly. And what happened in the 20th century was that the US instituted universal secondary education much ahead of everybody else in the world, and we build on that. We build our economy on that. This is the picture in 2003 that most people don't understand. This rank orders countries of the world, mainly OECD or developed countries, in 2003 by secondary school completion rates. The green line in the center is the OECD average. The red line is the United States. We are noticeably down below the OECD average in completion of secondary schooling. But in my opinion, that's not the real story. The real story is what we're learning per year of schooling or any unit of schooling you want. There have been a series of now about 25 international tests of different subject matters and grades over time, starting in the 1960s. And these math and science international tests provide us a way of comparing nations in terms of what people know at any point in time. This picture, I have to go progressively smaller so that you actually pay attention to me and don't read the pictures. But I'll tell you what this picture is all about. This, I won't if I hit. On the vertical axis is scores on these international tests over time. And on the horizontal axis are groups of countries. So the left-hand cluster of states are the European OECD countries, the developed countries of Europe. The second column is the OECD but non-European countries. The third column is the non-OECD East Asian countries. And the fourth column is the rest of the world, except for the first three. And what you see there, if you could actually read it, are names of countries and performance levels. And you see the cluster at the left is, in the top are the European countries that you know, Switzerland and Austria and the Netherlands and so forth. On the next column, there's a cluster at the top of 6 countries. In the bottom 6, which is a little bit below the 500 mark there, or noticeably below the 500 mark, is the United States performance. That performance is below all of the OECD, or most of the OECD European countries, except for Greece and Portugal help us out. And if you go to the right, you see the East Asian countries that aren't OECD. At the top of the second column, by the way, is Korea and Japan, which are OECD countries and have systematically done better. And then you see the other East Asian countries. And where we really shine is that we do much better than Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Peru, and a bunch of developing countries. Now, does it make a difference is the next question, though. And one way to see if it makes a difference is to look at differences in growth rates of nations over time, over long periods of time. The reason why the US is the top country in the world economically is that over the 20th century, we had a higher growth rate than everybody else in the world. We started at a reasonable level in 1900, but we had a higher growth rate. Growth rates are what make for future economic well-being. So here is a picture that plots, on the vertical axis is growth rates, and on the horizontal axis are these test scores. And these come from, there's some statistical analysis in the background to standardize for the level of income of the country. Because if you're a very high income country, it's harder to grow than if you're a low income country that can just imitate everybody above you. But if you standardize for the ability to imitate others above you and so forth and plot this out, what you see is that these countries of the world, everyone's a country there, fall pretty close to a straight line. Countries where the population is more skilled, have more knowledge of math and science, uniformly do better in terms of growth rates than other countries. Now you see out at the top is Singapore and Taiwan up at the top, high-performing countries. And if you can look right in the middle, above this line, is the USA. We're sort of average across these 50 countries that we can look at in terms of performance, and we are also average in terms of our growth rate at this point in time. It makes a big difference. And it is very descriptive of why some nations do better and other nations don't. So let me talk about whether it makes a big difference or not. First, here is another view of these international test scores, although there are some countries that we can follow their changes over time. And what you see, if you can actually look at it, at the top are Korea and Japan, and they've had test scores that have been high but constant over time. They haven't improved. Part of that might be that the tests aren't good enough to really differentiate at the top, but they've been pretty flat. But if you see, starting in the left-hand column and right in the middle, Finland stands out. It's a red line in it, and then all of a sudden it pops up to number 3 on this scale, Finland. Finland is the darling of the world today. Everybody takes education tourist trips to Finland because all of a sudden they've popped up at the top of the international rankings. What I want you to remember from this is you'll see, if you can trace some of these lines, there's a black line in the middle that's Canada, where Canada starts pretty low and it jumps up over time. And so remember Canada, and a country that you can probably barely see, it's the light green that's right below Finland on the right-hand side, is the Netherlands. These are countries that stand out for, over time, they've improved their scores. Let me show you the picture that relates to that. On this, The bottom, the horizontal axis is how much did scores improve over time? Did countries get better? And the top is whether at the same time their growth rates got better. Did they get an economic reward in terms of higher growth? Look out at the bottom, at the far right there, where you see the high growth countries that I pointed out are the Netherlands, NLD, Finland, FIN, and Canada. Those are countries that had high growth rates and they were rewarded with improved economic performance over this time period. Now, does it matter? Does it matter? You might all remember that in 1989, in this unique event, all of the governors of the nation met in Charlottesville, Virginia, to discuss the state of our schools. President Bush I convened all of the governors, and they came out with a bold statement that said, by the year 2000, we will be first in the world in math and science. Now, I just showed you that we didn't quite make it, right? And we aren't there yet. But if I put together the import of scoring first in the world, or what that would mean in terms of test scores, with those economic growth figures, I can calculate what it costs the nation not to have succeeded. This is the picture of first in the world by 2000. The left-hand axis is how much higher in percentage terms would GDP be at each year along the horizontal axis. So we start in 1989, and we put in place a reform policy that in 1989 has no impact, of course, because everybody's still in school. But we put in a reform policy that says by the year 2000, we will have people achieving at the top rates of math and science. What you see is the picture of the impact on the economy that grows over time as more of these students become central to the production and development of our economy. If you look there at 2014, keep your eye on 2014 there, because I'm going to put on top of that how much as a percentage of GDP we spend for K-12 education today. We spend about 4.5% of GDP for K-12 education today. What this says is, had we found a way to do what the governors said, that we would be first in the world in math and science, we could pay for our entire K-12 bill out of the increased GDP that we got out of that. K-12 education would be free today had we found a way to, in fact, improve performance. So let me move quickly here and talk about the traditional strategy we've used. The traditional strategy is putting money into it. So first, let me start with the international data. The international data says, here's the same countries that I had before of scores on these international math and science tests, and along the bottom is how much is spent. The red line is the line that you'd get for just drawing a line through all of those, but that's heavily driven by Mexico and Greece. And if you leave out Mexico and Greece, you find that across the world there is absolutely no relationship between what's spent on schools and student performance. I'll demonstrate quickly that that's the US story too. These are scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress for 17-year-olds. The clusters are math, reading, science, and writing in order. And each of the bars there are a different decade. So the blue is 1970, 1980, and the red hashed, 1990 and 2000. Now the way to look at this graph is just draw a straight line, a line across the top of the points. And what you'll see is that there's been a little bit of improvement in math, a little bit of improvement in reading over this 30-year period, a drop of noticeable amount in science, and a drop in writing scores over this period. So the way to summarize this in my mind would be performance has been flat between 1970 and 2000. But here's what we've done. We have decreased pupil-teacher ratios from 26 to 16. We now have more than half of the nation's teachers have master's degrees. They're more experienced. And at the bottom, in real dollars, standardized for inflation, we see that we've tripled the amount we spend on schools. Simple story. Just doing more of the same isn't going to work. Achievement matters a lot. More of the same, but more intensely, putting more money into it, by itself will have no impact unless the world is different today than it's been for the last 3 decades, and that we need some real reform.
Well, as Rick pointed out, there is a tremendous amount of evidence on this question. There are a lot of public policy questions where people can just go back and forth indefinitely because really we don't have enough evidence to know for sure what's going to solve our problems. This question, does money work in education, and what's a better solution, more money in the current system or market-based reforms, that's not one of those questions. This is a question where there's an enormous amount of evidence available. And to just go over a little bit of the same ground that Rick did from a slightly different angle, what he didn't mention is that in the 1980s and 90s he was doing other research on efficiency in public schools and whether higher spending in public schools in the US resulted in higher achievement. In fact, he's the leader in this field, basically. And what he found and what other researchers found is that overall there's no correlation between spending and achievement in US school districts or schools. It's also the case, as he pointed out, that real achievement in the end of high school, at the end of high school, has been flat since 1970. And some new data came out just last November and December that weren't featured in his presentation, data from 2 international tests, PISA and PEARLS. The first one looks at math, science, and reading, and the second one is just reading alone, and they cover the 4th and the 8th grades between the 2 of them. What happened in these tests is that every test score in every grade in both tests went down between either 2000 or 2001 when they were first administered and 2006 when the results were taken most recently. Some of these drops were statistically insignificant. They didn't drop by that much, and we're not sure that the drop is real, so it's called statistically insignificant. But several of them were statistically significant. There were real drops in mathematics achievement and in science achievement, according to these tests, since basically No Child Left Behind was enacted. And No Child Left Behind has a tab that I think Mike would probably be better able to assess than I am, but I think it's probably by now in the $100 billion range over its entire lifespan. Now, to graphically illustrate some of the same things that Rick was talking about, that blue line is spending in real inflation-adjusted dollars. The green line is reading achievement, and the red one is, the red line is reading achievement, the green line is mathematics achievement. You can see achievement's pretty much flat, and the Matterhorn is the increase in spending that we've seen over this time period, dating all the way back to the earliest data we have in 1920. There's just no correlation here between what we've been spending and achievement at the end of high school. And it's at the end of high school that matters most. It's wonderful that we've seen in recent years some upticks at the 4th grade level. Florida in particular has enjoyed some upticks at the 4th grade level on the NAEPS test scores, and that's a great thing. But when you look at the results for this long trend and you compare the results at the 4th grade and the 8th grade to the results for 17-year-olds towards the end of high school, you find that those early grades did not last, or those early improvements in the early grades did not last. That by the end of high school, kids know no more today, can do no more today academically than they could 30 years ago. So clearly we need to try something else. And an obvious thing for the most capitalistic, most free market, most liberty-loving country in the world would be to consider some kind of capitalistic, free market reform of the education system. And that's what the whole school choice movement is about in various ways. So a tremendous amount of research has actually been done, not just in the US, and in fact, particularly not in the US, over the past 25 years, comparing public and private schools. Tremendous amount of research. There are something like 92 statistically significant findings comparing public and private schools in different countries over these last 25 years. Of those, the overwhelming majority favor private provision, and just a small handful, relatively speaking, 8 times fewer, favor government provision of education. And what we're talking about here is a whole range of outcomes. This is a chart of the statistically significant findings and also the significant findings of a private advantage in education and of a government advantage. The yellow bars show statistically significant findings where private schools beat public schools, basically. Academic achievement, you can see the results are overwhelming. Efficiency even more so. Efficiency here is the academic test scores of the students divided by the amount of money that was spent per pupil. And so really, how much bang for your buck are you getting academically in the public versus the private sector? You can see it's overwhelmingly favoring the private sector. And there are no statistically significant findings that I was able to find in these other fields: parental satisfaction, orderliness, facilities, the later earnings of graduates, the highest grade level attained by students in the different sectors. All of these results have favored the private provision. But the thing is, public and private are very vague terms. Private school that we know and think of in this country is almost entirely funded by tuition, has comparatively little regulation. Schools pretty much teach what they want as far as the curriculum goes. As somebody observed in a question at lunch today, private schools in Florida don't have to take the FCAT, don't have to administer the FCAT to their students. So a private school in this country is relatively free market-like in some sense. Private schools in the Netherlands are fully funded by the state and have a state curriculum and have teacher training requirements imposed on them. It can't charge tuition and may not be operated for profit. So that's a completely different thing, but it's called a private school nonetheless. So when you look at results like I was showing you on the previous chart, and you say this is how public and private schools compare, you don't really know what to make of that from a policy standpoint, because private schooling doesn't always mean the same thing. Nor does public schooling, for that matter. In some countries, there are really vigorous school choice programs within the public sector. So to have any kind of clear evidence to make policy, you've got to be more specific than just public versus private. And so what I've done is to look at the international evidence a second time, this time saying, let's compare real market school systems where private schools are relatively autonomous. They do, like in the US, set their own curriculum and their testing requirements. They set their own teacher salaries, where at least some of their revenue comes directly from funds paid for in tuition by parents, what we normally think of as a market exchange, where a consumer gives money to a producer because they want something that that producer is offering them. So a real market education system. What happens in those systems when we compare them to real monopoly systems like the public school systems we have in the United States? In our country, there are no large-scale school choice programs that present real competition for public schools. There are a few small programs in Milwaukee and Cleveland, and there's obviously the scholarship tax credit program in Florida and the McKay Scholarship Program. But compared to the size of the public school system as a whole, these are very small programs that don't present real competition. And so we really do have education monopolies, public education monopolies in this country. So let's look at the international evidence again, this time comparing market to monopoly, or markets to monopolies. As you can see, there are only 2 findings that don't favor markets over monopolies. One of them is just statistically insignificant, and one of them is significant, and it favors monopoly provision. I think that result is from Indonesia. But what we're talking about here is just an overwhelming preponderance of evidence favoring real market provision. There are 33 findings, 31 of them are statistically significant and favor market provision of competitive market provision of education, competitive market schools. Only one favors the kind of monopoly system that we have in every state in this country and have had for more than a century. This is a much more dramatic difference, actually, than just the vague public versus private comparison. And interestingly enough, there are a number of studies showing that increased funding does make a difference in competitive markets. There are plenty of studies that look at the effect of raising teacher salaries on student outcomes. In the public sector, they have no effect. In the private sector, they raise student outcomes. Raising teacher salaries raises student outcomes. So money can matter in education. It's not as though education is some mysterious field where you can't possibly get a better product if you pay more. It's just that the system we have, the monopoly system we have, isn't good at translating higher spending into higher outcomes. So what can we draw from all of this? The first thing is that school choice is not enough. To just say we'll have choice, say within the public school monopoly, we'll allow people to choose the public school that they prefer. There are a lot of cases of school choice programs like this all over the world that don't perform any better than traditional monopoly school systems. What you need are real competitive markets where there is at least some payment of tuition by parents, where there is real autonomy for schools so that they can customize the kinds of services they're providing to the particular kids they're serving so that they can do a good job. We need real markets if we want real market results. The fortunate thing is that, especially for Florida, you're already on the right track in this state. The scholarship tax credit program, which was created about 7 years ago and was just expanded by the legislature last month, that program is very well designed. It does not impose a lot of state regulations on the schools that parents choose under this program. They can pretty much choose any school they want. The schools in this program do not have to administer government testing. The only problem with the program is that it's very small. And even with this recent enlargement, it will still serve perhaps 20 or 30,000 students. Dramatically improving the size, dramatically growing the size of that program will do wonders for the state. Another thing that can be done, which would help access to the educational marketplace, would be the creation of a personal use tax credit, where parents can get a tax credit for the cost of their own children's education. Now, this doesn't have to be against income taxes. There are tax credits already against sales taxes, and there are tax credits against property taxes, or can be. So it's possible, even in a state like Florida, to have personal use tax credits where you simply get a tax cut if you shoulder the financial burden for your own child's education. And as I'll be pointing out in a presentation tomorrow, taxpayers save big under these programs, and per pupil spending in public schools actually goes up. So because private schools are so much less expensive to operate, these programs not only advance choice, but they also save a lot of money. So thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Mike Petrilli. I'm at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm going to skip my PowerPoint presentation because I realize it's all words and you don't need to read a bunch of words. So, and I also have to admit that at the Fordham Institute, we are known in the education field as being education gadflies. We publish a newsletter called The Education Gadfly, which you can get at excellence.net. And, I'm used to going to conferences, and most of the time when I'm up on a panel, I'm the only one there who might be kind of pro-school reform. So I know I should say, wow, this is great. I mean, with Andrew and Rick and Lisa, and I'm among friends, and I should just sing with the choir, but we have this contrarian strain in Fordham, and I just can't help myself. So I decided to mix it up a little bit and question a bit of the, what we've heard so far today. By all means, I think we would all agree that money alone is not enough. But I think we want to be careful not to say that money doesn't matter. And I want to talk about a certain way, picking up on Andrew's point, that can we find a way to make money matter? Can we find a way where increases in achievement, increases in spending might result in increases in achievement? And that's this idea around weighted student funding. But let's be honest here that there are, even though in the aggregate, when we look at these international comparisons or state comparisons, we certainly see that in the aggregate, these differences in spending don't seem to be related to achievement. That if you're running a school, obviously money does matter. You heard me ask a question at lunch to Secretary Spellings about the Reading First program, $1 billion, which has really, in my view, catalyzed some great work at the state level around scientifically based reading instruction. The fact that money is going to go away, it looks like, is a real problem for those schools. We've done studies in the charter school world where we find that charter schools, on average, get about 80 cents on the dollar compared to traditional public schools. In many states, it's much worse than that. And you talk to charter school people and you say that's a real limitation. Why don't we have more charter schools in some states? Sometimes it's regulatory problems, but often it's because there's not enough money. Earlier this spring at Fordham, we came out with a report on Catholic schools. Now, a lot of people in the choice movement like to talk about how much less expensive private schools are than public schools. But in the Catholic school world, we've seen 1,300 Catholic schools, inner city, closed since the 1990s. 1,300, and that's displaced about 300,000 students. That's more students than were displaced by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And why is that happening? Well, you can think of lots of different reasons, but mostly it comes down to money. They are broke. And the costs in Catholic schools have risen dramatically as nuns have disappeared by and large. They now have to pay lay teachers reasonable salaries, and that's driven costs way up and out of the reach of many of the low-income or working-class families that used to send their kids to Catholic schools. And so they're closing for lack of money. So let's just be honest that while some of these differences in money may not matter in the aggregate, still money does matter to people who are running schools. Now the question is, how can we make money actually get the results that we want to get? And I think we would all agree that the way we fund our public education system right now is a complete and total disaster. It's really hard to figure it out. If you ever looked into public school finance, trying to figure out how is it that these dollars come in from the state and local school districts and the capital money and this money, it's a total morass. And there's a complete lack of transparency, which is a big problem in of itself. And then in many states, you have all kinds of funding streams coming into a school that says, here's some money if you want to have class size reduction, but if you're not really focused on class size reduction, you'd rather spend that money on teacher training or technology or increasing salaries of physics teachers, well, I'm sorry, you can't use it for that. And we have states where there are literally hundreds of those kinds of funding streams, each with their own restrictions and their own rules. And you end up getting a situation where schools are hemmed in by all these requirements, and they just don't have the flexibility to try new things and to really innovate. So how can we do this differently? At the Fordham Institute, we've been promoting an idea. It's certainly not our idea. It's been out there for a long time, called weighted student funding. We helped to publish a manifesto a couple years ago called Fund the Child. I believe, Lisa, did you sign? Did you sign that? Yeah. Yeah, and Lisa's been doing great work on weighted student funding since then. I should point out that Rick refused to sign it, and we can talk about that later. I believe he was worried that it maybe implied that too much spending was important. Well, we can let Rick, no? All right, we'll let Rick answer that. But the manifesto was very simple. It said, look, we have a problem right now in our funding. Our funding is inequitable. Our funding comes with all these strings attached that make it hard for schools to change the way they're working. And we have a funding system that's not at all transparent. And we have a funding system that's not very friendly to choice. And so the vision here is, can we get to an education system where parents get to make choices, where schools are held accountable for results, and where money truly is portable, where it goes on the back of a kid and it follows them to the school they are attending. Even if we don't have the debate about whether those schools should include private schools or not, even if we're just talking about public schools, including public charter schools that have to take the state tests, that have to show results for the money, even if we're talking about that, today's system doesn't work very well in terms of letting kids make choices, because a child may move from a district school to a charter school or between two district schools, and the money doesn't necessarily go with them. And we think that that's crazy. Now, have any of you been reading or seeing the articles about Clay Christensen's new book? Does this ring a bell? About disruptive learning. This is a Harvard Business School professor that's written a lot about disruptive technologies in other industries, and he now has a new book out on education. And he's predicting that within a relatively short time, 1/2 of high school courses are going to be taken online. And, to me, that sounds ambitious, but it's very much doable. I mean, you see what's happening here in Florida with the Florida Virtual Academy and others, and you say, yeah, this could happen in the, 10, certainly 20 years, more and more kids learning online. You see what's happened in the supplemental services field, not just under No Child Left Behind, but in general. People going to Sylvan Learning Centers after school with their kids. People getting tutoring at night, in the morning, on weekends, summer programs. There is now all kinds of options out there for parents, and parents increasingly are a la carte shoppers. Right? They don't expect everything to come necessarily from their public schools, or at least affluent parents now are getting in the habit of supplementing what they're getting in their public schools and going to shop around to piece together a full package. I suspect that's going to continue. And I suspect that would be good for education, because it means new providers coming in, new energy, new innovation, new ways of doing things. It means customizing education for kids, more online learning. But all of this is very difficult to get to in our current education system. Because right now, by and large, the dollars that we spend in education, more than $500 billion in the most recent year, those dollars fund school districts, they fund schools, they fund programs, they don't fund kids. Now, can you imagine a day when we could have a situation where every parent out there got a debit card, an education debit card? Let's say in Florida it has $8,000 on it, and they can use that debit card to purchase educational goods for their child. And the offerings, they all have to be held accountable for results. They have to show that that they're high quality. And a big chunk of that $8,000 might be spent at a traditional school, but some of it could be spent after school. Some of it could be spent online. Okay, you get where I'm going. To really allow all parents to be able to piece together a comprehensive education for their child. But that kind of debit card, so to speak, is not possible today when we have the convoluted funding system that we've got. When we've got money coming in, some from the state, some from local school districts, all these complex formulas. If you cross a district, the money doesn't come with you. So if we want to get to the vision where there is a lot of choice in education, where there is portability, where there is the opportunity to have this kind of innovation, we've got to tackle this funding system too. And a final thought. If we do move to this kind of debit system, does it make sense for some parents to have more money loaded onto their debit card than others? Right now, I would suspect that if you really were able, and it's really hard to do, but if you were really able to pinpoint how much money per pupil is going in to individual schools, and you did that, say, in a metro area, you would probably find almost surely that the schools serving the most affluent kids are spending more money than the poor kids. Right? And we know all the reasons why that's happening. And so if you translated this into a debit card, it would mean that rich parents might get $10,000 on their debit card, and poor parents would get $6,000 on their debit card. Now, I don't think any of us would feel like that was fair. Just a basic sense of fairness would say that doesn't sound right. If anything, you might argue that it should be flipped to some degree so that poor parents actually get more money on their debit card because their kids are overcoming more hurdles. They have fewer resources of their own to add in. But I think if we want to get to that vision, we have to be honest both about the equity issue as well as about these issues around transparency and choice. And that starts by saying that money can matter if we figure out a way to spend that money more wisely, and that starts by recreating the system that we've got. Thanks.
I'm going to start out with a question, and then can we go for the audience? Is that okay? Mike, now, I obviously am on board with the weighted student formula. Can you talk a little bit about the other components of that? Because for instance, the whole state of New Jersey, I was talking about the Abbott districts earlier, and they have a new school funding plan where the money does follow the child into the district. Mm-hmm. But that's as far as it goes, which arguably that is much better than spending $20,000 on some poor kids and then in other districts not.
Right.
But what else at the school level matters?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Lisa. In order to make this work and to be really powerful, you want the money to follow the child all the way to the school level. And that does not happen today because, again, we fund school districts by and large. And then from there, it's a complete mystery about where the money goes. And the decisions about how money goes from a school district to a school tend to get made regarding programs and teachers. It gets hidden. But there's been some very good research done lately by Marguerite Rosa out of the University of Washington and others that shows that if you pay attention, for example, to the payrolls at local schools and how much money they're paying teachers, well, we all know that the more experienced teachers, for a variety of reasons, end up over time tend to be clustered in the more affluent schools in a district. And so those payrolls of those districts are often much, much higher than in the poor schools. So even if you've gotten equity to the district level, if you're still allowing these big discrepancies in terms of the payroll of the teaching staff school by school, you could still have huge inequities within school districts. But even then, that's the equity issue. But the another big issue is when the money gets to the school, does the school principal actually have some discretion about how to spend those dollars? And what I was trying to explain earlier was that right now, a lot of that money arrives and it's got all kinds of strings attached. It says, here's some of your money and you must spend it on class size reduction. And we think that's crazy because that assumes that every school in a state necessarily thinks that reducing class sizes is their top priority. Some it may, some may not. What we would like to see is something more like we see in the charter school world, which is that the money gets to the school, it comes in some sort of block grant, it's flexible funding, and it's up to the principal to decide how to use that money in a strategic way. It could be in raising teacher salaries, maybe performance pay for teachers, maybe lowering class size, whatever would make sense for that school in return for being held accountable for results.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Now, in fairness, can I ask each panelist one quick question if we make it quick? How much time do we have left?
We have plenty of time.
Okay, so, Eric, then my question for you is, you had an article recently in Education Next about largely what your presentation was about, and one of the things I took away from that is that while obviously we could have paid for our whole K-12 education system if we scored higher and had more growth and were more productive, but also because of our economic freedoms, right? We did a lot better than we should have as far as our scores went. And, I talked to a lot of economists, say like Russ Roberts. He would argue that you only need like a few Bill Gates or highly leveraged people that have freedom to make lots of difference for the economy. And do you think that we're losing that economic advantage, or what will be the role of that we have a relatively free economy versus some of these other high-scoring countries that may have high scores but not economic freedoms? And could you speak to that?
I'd be happy to. I didn't go into any detail, but there are two things that seem to make a huge difference in terms of the economic performance of nations. And one is the cognitive skills, the quality of the labor force. But the second is the quality of the economic institutions that Lisa just brought up. The United States has had a strong system of enforceable contracts and property rights enforceable in contracts that are enforceable in courts. It's had free and open labor and product markets. It's had minimal intrusion of government in both production and taxes compared to most of the other countries of the world. And that has been a huge advantage to the United States. And that has interacted with the fact that we have over time had also a very skilled labor force relative to the rest of the world. I showed you that the rest of the world has essentially caught up in terms of the education and training and skills of their populations. There's more schooling, it's higher quality, and so forth. What I didn't point out, but should be obvious if you think about it for a minute, is that many other countries are now emulating us in terms of the quality of economic institutions. So Hong Kong has been the classic example that has had minimal governmental involvement in the economy, but that's what is driving China and India right now, is this loosening up from a horrid economic system to one that is quite a bit better and moving toward us. And that's what's happening when Sweden cuts its tax rates by 20 percentage points at the top and so forth, is that they're trying to move in the same direction. And so in the long run, it's this interaction where the rest of the world has seen what we've done and are emulating us and doing better than us.
Thanks, Eric. And then Andrew, for you, obviously we need more markets, and we'd all agree with that. And I know that you have another presentation that may go into this, maybe your answer, but if you give us the short answer about what is the vision to move from a largely tight public school monopoly to these freer markets without kind of weighted student formula, charter schools. While the growth, especially this year in tax credit legislation, we've had some big programs come online in the last few weeks. But still, in the scheme of things, it's really nothing. So what can we do, or how can we get there?
No, that's a really great question. Obviously, there are a lot of different routes that we can take if we really want to go to a more market-like system of education. And I've been looking at different alternatives over the past 10, 15 years now, and there's a number of important things that we have to keep in mind. And one is that not every route that looks promising will in fact be promising, even in the short term. So if you look at, for instance, just public school choice type things, they don't actually do that much. So some routes just are not effective. We can look at the evidence and say, well, that's not even worth pursuing in the short term. Then there are other routes that you can look at, things like charter schools, for instance, which in the short term certainly do seem promising in many ways, but that might have risks, long-term risks. And even vouchers I have some concerns about in the long term. And a good case to look at is the Netherlands, which has had a national school voucher program since 1917. Well, as I understand it, in the early years, it was very free. Anyone could, open up a school as long as you could show demand. Now the voucher program in the Netherlands looks like a very bad charter school law in U.S. parlance because it's so heavily regulated. So I tend to favor tax credits over vouchers and charter schools because I think that it brings with it the best chance for market effects and the least chance of regulatory encroachment over time, which is why I favor programs like Florida's. And I think that because Florida has shown change now in the political support from being a strict party line program to a bipartisan program with the most recent vote, this prospect to me has the best long-term chances.
I just want to be contrarian again, just to mix it up. It's good for the audience, right? You want to see us mix it up. I would just argue that if we want to keep really bad regulations from happening to these choice programs, then we might want to proactively embrace some good regulations. And I would call good regulations ones that focus on student achievement and say that the schools that participate in choice programs should show that their students are making progress in terms of achievement. And if we can make that case, then perhaps we can convince the government to lay off. But I've certainly been a part of and been close to some choice programs, that have had some of those schools that you cringe and say, wow, they should never have been a part of this program to begin with. And that can really do long-term damage politically when you have some schools that are just getting miserable results and can continue in a program. So I think we agree on the long-term vision, which is we want fairly light regulation, particularly around inputs and curriculum and all of that. But perhaps we would disagree on the best way to get there.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I'd say that's an empirical question. So do we need the government to step in and say, these are the standards that a school should meet in order to participate in a choice program? And the brunt of my presentation was that we don't. Yeah. That the research shows when you compare public versus private, you get less dramatic results than if you compare free market versus monopoly. The less regulated market schools do better than the more regulated public school or private schools.
All right. Well, I was trying to make a political point, which is just, that you can run into big problems politically. We've seen this in the Ohio charter school movement where we do a lot of work, that, you have a few bad apples that can really give you some big headaches politically and can damage a choice movement. So I think we may agree, but the politics may say, hey, what can we do to police our own, so to speak?
I think we're ready for the audience
All right,
now.
some audience questions. And also, before we start that, I just want to remind everybody on your table, there's an evaluation form particular to this session. Before you leave this session, maybe right now, you can start filling it out, and you can leave it at the back of the room there with Kara, or give it to me. Kara's standing back there, and gosh, we got a lot of questions.
Hi, Jim Gunner with Central Michigan University. Do you ever envision the day where schools are paid for academic performance rather than seat time? And is there anybody in the world doing that? And what would a transition to that type of system look like?
Do you guys want to take?
I'm going through my mental catalog here, and I'm not sure that I know of anybody in the world who's doing it. But it does, in fact, respond partially to my major objection to weighted student funding, is that it does not reward high performance or not, and you only get high performance if, in fact, the rest of the institutional structure allows it to happen. My preferred way of funding schools would be, in fact, to reward schools that were doing well and teachers that were doing well within those schools, and not reward those who were doing poorly or not well. And so I don't know of anybody who pays entirely that way, and it'd be a big revolution to say, well, you really don't have to go to school 180 days, although we've done a lot of that. We allow virtual charter schools, we allow homeschooling by 2% of our population, which is eliminating the 180 days, but we don't have a strong system of rewards for good performance.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that. That actually was tried. In 1872, the British Parliament passed the Payment by Results Act, which actually paid schools, private schools, for getting students to pass certain tests. And it was mostly reading, and I think there might have been some math, too. The system was totally scammed and was eventually abolished. And basically, the reading test was to read a passage from a test book, and the teachers would have the kids memorize these passages, spend much more time on that because they weren't very long, much easier than actually teaching them how to read any old text, just memorize the one passage. And a few of the inspectors who were charged with going around to the schools and finding out who was meeting who got the payments, would take the textbook and they would turn it upside down. And the kids could still read it, quote unquote, because they weren't actually reading at all. And then they'd have them close the book and they could keep going on. So this kind of thing is really, it's like trying to build a market in a monopoly environment. There's just no point to it. Why not just create a market that actually solves these accountability problems in every other field?
Don Rochter, Public Interest Institute. This is a follow-up question for Eric. In that graph you showed us with the red line dotted across and showing that the United States was getting more bang for its buck than it should, is part of that reason also because we're skimming the cream off of a lot of other countries' very talented people who come into our country because of our looser immigration policies?
I think immigration is indeed a part of it. The fact that our colleges and universities also make up for some of the shortcomings of K to 12 is another part of it. But we are increasingly dependent upon high-skilled labor from outside. And if you're from California, you realize we're also increasingly dependent upon high-skilled labor from other states, that our state is doing so badly. But it's the same thing of trying to keep the economy going requires today in many places a very highly skilled labor force. And businesses either go to that skilled labor force or bring the skilled labor force to it.
This is a question for Eric as well. In looking at your charts about education levels, where our standing is, I have a friend who works for a textbook company, and she said in the last 10 years, the work they used to prepare in textbooks for third graders, they now do for fifth graders. I was just wondering so that's a dumbing down that's happening pretty rapidly. Wondering if what the analysis that you've done takes that into account, whether what we're looking at from 1970, is that actual knowledge in 1970 to actual knowledge in 2000, or is it a different standard even, so that it's even worse than what it looks like?
The NAEP scores are, in fact, exactly the same standard because for the reading and math tests, they gave exactly the same test over time, so that there's no change in the test. Now, there might be some change in what was required, but I think for 4th and 8th grade math, you might think that we still have the same ideals. So that's not involved. The comparison of the world test is a little bit trickier, but as far as we've made a lot of efforts to try to standardize where we are relative to other countries across time, and I think that we've got at least the right ranking and pretty close to who's improved and who hasn't.
Hi, Lil Kellogg with ENA. Question, we saw at Finland and Netherlands and Canada, and they're obviously doing some right things, and wondering how are they investing, compared to the strategies that you're suggesting today. So where are they getting the ROI, and how are they, where are they investing? Because obviously education costs money, but where are they investing their dollars to get that return?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there's actually been a lot of effort designed to look at this recently. I'm a little skeptical of whether we'll be able to take the lessons from Finland and import them to the U.S. or from Hong Kong and import them to the U.S. just because there are so many things that are different. Now, that having been said, there was a recent attempt by Michael Barber, or Sir Michael Barber of the UK, who is working for McKinsey Company now, and he and some associates at McKinsey tried to say, what are the high-performing nations doing that the other countries aren't? And they have a whole list of things which you may or may not agree with. The one that I identified with that stood out in their list for me was that high-performing countries do not allow ineffective teachers to remain in the classroom for very long. Now, I mean, that's a very different statement from all the other statements and so on, but it basically says that what we do, where we make no decisions about the effectiveness of a teacher and their continuation, the high-performing countries don't do that. Now, they have different systems for how you get the high-performing teachers either out of the classroom or changed in some manner, but that's the one thing that I identify with.
Dr. Robert Dreyfus with Liberty Sentinel. In spite of all the money and the reforms that we've attempted over the decades, the public schools have been devastating to our children in almost every respect. And I recently picked up this book, Leaving School, Finding Education. And I'd like to just read an excerpt from that and have you all comment upon it. It says, quote, "We believe after very full careers in schools as teachers, administrators, and curriculum leaders that defining any improvement in the school will be both a futile exercise and a self-defeating proposition. The American school cannot be fixed. We believe the United States must seriously explore abandoning the school as the vessel of learning and move to redefine education in terms of other options."
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I do think that there's some wisdom that says that we need to not be wedded to the idea of school as we have it right now. And I guess, I've indicated already that I do buy into this idea that online learning really does have the potential to transform learning in a big way. And we already see that in the homeschooling movement and these virtual charter schools, and I think it's got potential to be much bigger than that. Schools, they play a custodial role. Parents need some place to send their kids during the day. They play an academic role, that they're expected to teach some things. And then they do a lot of other things in terms of socializing and maybe sports and activities and other enrichment type things. And you could certainly argue that what we call school today doesn't necessarily have to do all three of those. And you can imagine for some parents that they might want to handle the academics themselves at home, at night, on the weekends, in a very efficient way, helping, maybe with online learning, helping with that. And then have their kids during the workday someplace where they're focused not on academic things. So, I think that the world that we're heading towards is going to look a lot different than we have today. And we do need to get away from this idea that, all learning is going to happen within schools as we think of them.
I would just slightly object to that, in that I think that lots of things can be done with virtual charter schools and new technology in the classrooms, but we're going to have public schools for the majority of our kids for a long time, and I don't think in my own mind that we should say, well, what would happen if we just wiped them all out and did something different? I just don't think that's a plausible strategy.
Get one up here, and then up here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Valerie Smith. I'm the Secretary's regional rep for New York City. Okay, thank you. New Jersey was mentioned several times, and I just wanted to make a comment about the Jersey preschool program. For everyone that's attending this conference, the Jersey preschool program is actually one of the largest voucher programs in the United States. And the reason why is because the court mandated vouchers, it mandated that all Title I students be able to attend a preschool at the state expense. The problem is that our public schools aren't large enough to afford classrooms for this program. Thus, private institutions are taking up these students. So in a way, it is a voucher program. I think we have about 40,000 students in there that are enrolled right now, and actually Governor Coulson wants to make that universal so that all students are able to go into a preschool program. Again, we don't have the school capacity, we don't have the brick and mortar to make that truly a reality. So it's going to put more pressure on the private schools. So it is a voucher program, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, can I answer that? I'll take that one. You know, and I guess that's the whole point about investment in preschool is that certainly we have a private program that 80% of kids in the United States go to. It's not a voucher program, it's a mixed program with all kinds of different funding streams, lots of private money from parents, and it's a mixed delivery system. And in 1965, only 15% of kids went. And the point is if you want preschool to teach your kids letters and to learn their colors and to spend their day, that's one thing. And that's great. And that's, you know, what we could all agree that we might make some kind of investment in that, some kind of investment in disadvantaged kids. But if we want the state to have it as a goal through government-funded money, whether it's a voucher program or a completely public school provision, to invest in early education in the hopes that that's going to make the difference for K-12 education, that's something entirely different. So the question is, can any four-year-old program, whether it's a voucher program, competitive or not, make the difference for a poor quality K-12 system? And I think that's where we differ. So it's great that New Jersey does take advantage of the private providers, which gives parents a lot more choices, which makes for a compelling array of choices for four-year-olds, but it hasn't made a difference academically for Abbott districts in terms of their overall performance.
No, it hasn't. You're absolutely correct. But I would just like to add that it's a foot in the door for alternative forms of education for K through 12.
Right. I mean, it's the backwards thinking. If we had vouchers and state funded for preschool, would that mean that we then would be more likely to improve school choice programs for everyone else? But the fact is, we have private preschool in the United States right now that 80% of kids go to home daycares, Montessori, private preschools. In the state of California, we have the largest actually preschool voucher program because parents get to take their subsidized CalWorks money with them into private preschools. It's done nothing for competition and choice in K-12. So logically, I'm not sure that having all preschoolers in a mixed provider system would make the entrenched interest any more likely to have more choice and competition in the K-12 structure we have now without any other kinds of changes.
Lil Renoir, Mount Vernon, New York. In talking about the school, I can hear you guys really referring to charter school. But when we get to major metropolitan areas like New York City or Mount Vernon areas, where you're dealing in the majority with people, poor people, less fortunate ones, lots of immigrants who don't even speak English, how are they going to help their children if we have online teaching? How are these parents going to teach their children English? Number two, you talked about the Catholic school closing. You have to notice that those Catholic schools that have closed are in great majority in the major metropolitan areas where you have the poor parents and the poor students. Those parents who used to be there paying the school fees, the tuition, are no longer there. And the ones that are in there right now are the immigrants, the minorities who can't afford to pay. That's the reason why the schools are closing. Can you address that, please?
Sure. So on the Catholic school issue, I absolutely, you now have an influx of immigrants and other low-income families that are in the communities where these Catholic schools are. Of course, there was a time when there was an earlier wave of immigrants that lived in those communities, and they were also poor. I would argue the difference is that the Catholic schools have become much more expensive than they used to be. That's partly because of the labor force. You know, there was a time when back in the 50s, over 90% of Catholic school teachers were religious, so they were nuns or priests, and while they had to be paid something, they weren't paid directly from the schools a whole lot. And so Catholic schools were much more affordable. There was also subsidies from the church, and so now you see costs have gone up as they've hired lay teachers, and subsidies from the church have gone down, passing along a lot of these costs to parents, and they can't afford it. In terms of online learning, I think you're right that nobody yet has figured out how to make online learning an option that works really well for low-income kids who perhaps aren't going to have the same supports at home as other kids. But I still think there's potential. I mean, there are some models now, and you see a couple of places around the country where, for example, you have schools where kids are spending most of their days, there in front of a laptop, and the person in their classroom is more of a facilitator, is more of a guide, but they're getting really good content from experts from afar. And that might be something that works really well in a rural community that might not have the teacher expertise it needs, or sometimes in urban areas where it's hard to get the teachers needed. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer for everybody or that that's all we should do, but we should, I think, continue to experiment with that kind of thing, and I think somebody's going to figure out how to use the online learning platform really well for poor kids too.
I'm Marshall DeRosa, political scientist at Florida Atlantic University, and this question is for Mr. Coulson. Felt a bit out of sorts this afternoon at lunch with the Secretary of Education, Secretary Spellings, and I want your opinion. Do you see No Child Left Behind, or even the U.S. Department of Education, as more of a problem or more of a solution? And if, based upon your answer, if you could go into a little bit of an explanation there. And did you feel a bit uncomfortable with that type of presentation and the sort of raw behind it?
There was a question at one point about from someone running a charter school, and he was asking if maybe it wouldn't be better if the federal government would butt out and let the accountability of the marketplace take care of their quality. And there was, I think, one person or two people clapping. Well, I was one of those two people. I don't think that I was one of the friendly faces that Secretary Spellings was talking about when she was introducing her presentation. I have absolutely nothing good to say about the No Child Left Behind Act on so many levels. The federal government does not have a role in education accorded to it by the U.S. Constitution. And if conservatives and libertarians don't stand up for the Constitution, no one else is going to. So the fact that we've transgressed the Constitution now for some 50 years by having it, first a National Defense Education Act, and then these other acts, and then a Federal Department of Education created by President Carter, doesn't mean that it's good to continue flouting the Constitution. So I would advocate the repeal of the No Child Left Behind Act on constitutional grounds alone. Then there's a practical question. Does it do any good? Well, there have been some improvements in fourth grade test scores and even some in eighth grade test scores on the NAEP, but on the PISA and Pearls International tests, there have been declines. So it's not clear that the No Child Left Behind Act has done any good at all. And it has very expensively distracted conservatives especially from market reforms. The idea that we could fix the monopoly, that a monopoly could be fixed by having the government set standards for it, is just not something that's well supported by the evidence and is completely unrealistic based on the history of monopolies in general. So, yeah, I was a little uncomfortable with that presentation too.
I think Eric wants to respond to that quickly.
I'll give the other side of it. I actually have come to believe that you cannot have effective choice programs without good accountability, or at least performance measurement, and vice versa. You can't have good accountability programs without choice, because the accountability programs will be eaten up by the NEA, as is going on now, without choice and some alternatives to keep it in place. And I'm actually a big fan of the idea of accountability, test-based accountability as included in NCLB, which is not to say that I think that the details are at all right. I think that lots of things have to be fixed, but that we would be in much worse shape if we backed off from it.
I think we're not going to solve that one right here in the last 3 minutes. We have time for one more question, right? Two more, okay.
Mark Halpert, the Learning Disabilities Association of Florida. One thing I'll say is that most parents who take the McKay Scholarship that I've met, and I've met probably hundreds of them, which is just for kids with disabilities, take it because they don't have to take the test, not necessarily because it's a better education. So it's a false belief in that to one suspect. But the real question I wanted to ask, because Eric, you put up something that was really interesting. In 1970, when we finished a decade where the president actually gave a damn about math and science, we had stellar scores. You put up another slide which had the economic value of great math and science scores would be phenomenal in terms of benefit to America. Without arguing whether it's private or public, what can we do with market forces to refocus on math and science so we get those benefits?
This is going to take us into the next block, of course, to answer this question, and there's lots of disagreement. I think that that's partly behind some of this accountability, is that math and science and basic reading skills, that you can't do that, and that accountability for basic skills is extraordinarily important. But we have let it slip. There's just no doubt about it, and that providing direct incentives to get better instruction and more effective instruction in math and science, I think, is extraordinarily important for this nation. And it's the silent crisis, because, you know, we do pretty well because we have this well-functioning economy. But in 25 years, when the full competitive forces hit us, then we are going to be in a much more difficult shape to recover.
Bob Schoolfield from Austin, Texas, Austin Children's Educational Opportunity Foundation. One quick comment: I wish people would use my soundbite more with regard to bad charter schools and bad private schools that have vouchers. And it's very simple. Isn't it wonderful when a bad school can fail and actually go out of business and only be a temporary problem rather than a permanent problem? Yeah. That's all you need to say. Yeah. The second thing is he was concerned about destroying the entire public school system. With a clean voucher system, every public school becomes a private school. They may have public school on the door, but they're having to engage in a private economy. And then the last, I hope that no one disagrees with your debit card. I mean, yeah. That's so much more choice. I don't have to use the entire voucher at one place at one time. No questions there, just 3 comments.
All right.
Thanks, Bob.
Let me just briefly say, of course I agree with you that it's wonderful when bad charter schools close. The problem is when bad charter schools stay open for years and years and years. And we've seen that in Ohio, and it's been a real thorn in our side, that it's turned out to be politically difficult to close bad charter schools, just as it's politically difficult to close bad public schools. And so we need to think about that and figure out, what does that mean for the movement?
Well, thank you all for coming. And I just want to give a plug in the back. There's some copies of a video from our Drew Carey project at the Reason Foundation about a good charter school, Green Dot Charters, and Steve Barr. And if you're interested in watching, it's just like an 8-minute film, but it shows really the takeover of Locke High School by Green Dot, and it's the actual footage in the school board meeting where it was decided. And the bonus is that you can hear the union rep call Steve Barr the devil. So it's good entertainment, and feel free to take one in the back if you'd like.
I just also have one housekeeping announcement. On your schedule, it says that strategy number 3 is in the Ballroom of the Americas. Upstairs, that's not the case. It's actually going to be in Nutcracker 1, which is just this way. So strategy session number 3, if you plan to attend, that will be in Nutcracker 1. Thank you. And don't forget the evaluation forms at the back.